we are always excited when we have smart people who are our guests. And we got a great compliment yesterday about our listeners are really smart listeners. Yes, they are. You guys are important to our show because you share ideas. And when I talk about amplifying our message, this is what I meant. That's what I mean. We've got very, very smart listeners and plugged in listeners. But we also have some pretty smart people that are guests on our show. And with us today is none other than American scholar of politics and law and just a bunch of important stuff. And that would be none other than Kim Scheppele, who's joined us this morning here on Choose Views. Good morning, Kim, and thanks for being with us today.
Good morning. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. Well, Henry was kind enough to take the hit because I mispronounced your name earlier. So,
but you're not alone.
Listen, I will, a little quiet secret. My last name is Chew, Chew. You can imagine how many times it's misspelled or mispronounced. So I'm with you. You and I are in this. We're in the same camp on that. We've lived our lives with that mispronunciation. So I get it. I'm with you.
Right.
Welcome to the show. I mean,
thank you.
You've got some Chicago roots in terms of your educational background. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do. I did my PhD in legal training at Chicago, at the University of Chicago. And I have fond memories of when I just heard your weather forecast at the top of the hour. I thought, I remember that. And it feels colder to be there. So, yeah, no, I love Chicago. It's a great city. And while I was at the University of Chicago, I spent a lot of time on the north side in a whole variety of, poetry groups. Because back then I used to write poetry and I edited a literary magazine. And so, in addition to all my academic stuff, I was hanging out in various poetry readings on the north side. So,
cool.
Still come back, still love it, still have friends there. Great city.
Well, we thank you for saying that. Chicago is a great city, and we are blessed to be a big blue city in this current environment that we're in, and led by some really smart people, both on a local, state level, that are doing the work to try to offset and shore up against one of the areas that you're an expert in. And I say that meaning it to its core, and that expertise has come from your life experience in talking about where we, in many ways are headed, and that's to some form of autocracy with our federal government. So, tell us a little bit about this most recent work that you've been doing and conversations that you've been having in this space, Kim.
Yeah, well, so it's slightly depressing, but, it's nice to be in a blue city, although I'm beginning to think that even that isn't going to make us safe. So, buckle up. So about 20 years ago, a lot of people in the world started noticing that a lot of countries that had been, at least marginally democratic, even some that had been more fully democratic, were beginning to slide back toward autocracy. And the interesting thing about this wave, and now we're way, into it, and the number of countries that had been thought of as what the political scientists call consolidated democracies have become full-blown autocracies, And unfortunately, I specialize in Eastern Europe, and I rode that escalator down from promising democracy to dictatorship, first in Russia, where I lived for a while and worked at the Constitutional Court there, and then Viktor Orbán came to power in Hungary, where I had lived and worked for most of the 90s. And so I jumped back in to follow what he was doing there. And unfortunately, our current government-to-be, the circles around Donald Trump, have gotten extremely close to the circles around Viktor Orbán. And what was happening in Hungary is now looking like it's a model for what's going to happen here. And just to give you one scary fact as a preamble to that, Orbán has an English language sort of propaganda think tank called the Danube Institute, and they had a formal understanding with the Heritage Foundation to write parts of Project 2025.
Yeah.
So, this is a very close relationship now, and unfortunately, Hungary has become a kind of warning sign for all of us who care about keeping democracy intact.
So I'm going to ask this question as it relates to human beings. And you have a legal background, you have a sociological background, so you can probably not, you have to give yourself an asterisk of saying, I'm not a doctor, but this is kind of a human question. Do you think human beings are prone to or led to or want to be led by a dictator?
Well, I actually don't think so. And all of the surveys, I look at a lot of survey data. Like I said, I've lived now in 3 countries, if you count the U.S., going through this, and I've visited and talked to and done, at least some interview work and many more. When people vote for dictators, usually they don't know they're voting for dictators, or they don't believe that they're voting for dictators. So just like this last American election, where people are like, well, yeah, Trump may have some autocratic tendencies, but the price of eggs, ... right? So that kind of thing happens in other places too, that people feel like there are really immediate needs. They don't believe, if they've gotten used to living in a democracy, that there are elections that are simply not normal, where democracy is on the ballot. What I was really struck by was, lots of surveys in Hungary. Like if you take surveys around Eastern Europe, for example, the country that has the highest commitment to democratic values, and for that matter, the highest commitment to the European Union, was Hungary, followed closely by Poland. And those were the 2 countries that have been through these autocratic lurches over the last decade and a half, while countries that had populations that were much less committed to, for example, peaceful rotation of power, independence of the judiciary, free and fair elections. There's a lot of questions you can ask to tap different sides of what it means to be committed to a democracy. Countries that had less commitment to those values nonetheless succeeded in electing democratic governments that stayed democratic. So there's almost no relationship between what people say they want on surveys and what they get when they vote. And I do think it's because people, I think Americans have, with the end of the Cold War, because I used to study that part of the world, I still study that part of the world. At the end of the Cold War, Americans don't have what it means to be a dictatorship in their face every day. And so they kind of believe it's not real. They kind of believe that what it means to be in a dictatorship is that somebody you didn't like got elected, and for a while you hold your nose and you really wish that the government weren't doing what it was doing. But then you have an election and it all goes away, right? But that's not what we mean. The thing about autocracy, excuse me, I have early morning frog in my throat. The thing about autocracy is that these guys come into power and they entrench themselves so that you can't get rid of them. They eliminate checks and balances. They strive to manipulate the next election so that you can't vote them out of power. They put their cronies in all over the place, or they destroy the independence of important institutions, so that even if you do manage to get rid of them temporarily, you don't get rid of their effects. So let me just give you one example from the U.S., since your listeners will know that one best. When Trump was in office the first time, he packed the Supreme Court with loyalists. And that meant that even though he was voted out, Joe Biden came in, and the Supreme Court, together with red state attorneys general from around the country, challenged almost everything that Biden did. They challenged his immigration policy. They challenged the student loan program multiple times. They were in court trying to block the effectiveness of regulations. And very often the courts, often without even hearing arguments or writing opinions, the Supreme Court now, makes major policy decisions on cases that were never fully briefed or argued. The Supreme Court backed up the Trumpists who were still left all over government and kept blocking Biden's initiatives. So even though there was an election that brought Biden to power, Trump's long arm through the Supreme Court blocked a lot of Biden's initiatives, giving Biden the image of being an ineffective president to many people who might have benefited from those programs, and that paved the way for Trump to come back. Now, sometimes you get this is the exact scenario that's happening right now in Poland, where there was an autocratically inclined government in place from 2015 until 2023. In 2023, that government was voted out. New government came in. Everybody said, great, the democracy is back in Poland. But the new government controls both houses of parliament. They control the prime ministership. But there's a president who has to sign off on laws, who has a different term of office. And that president is still associated with the past government.
Right.
So every time the new parliament passes a law, this president vetoes it. So they can't govern and they can't do anything. And at the next election, they will look hopeless and they may get voted out again. Mm-hmm. So, autocracy comes in these steps where, you capture the presidency, you capture the courts, which also happen in Poland, by the way. And then even if you can get a temporary rotation of power, it falls back into this slide toward autocracy as the autocrat comes back and entrenches himself in more and more institutions. So that's how it works. It's not all at once. It's not tanks in the streets. It's not something that the average person will see right away. But over time, it simply means you lose your possibility of democratic choice.
Yeah, it's a drip, 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 slowly. And when you have an electorate, a society that doesn't pay attention, they don't see it sliding away. I'm going to take a little bit of a cultural piece for a moment here. Black folks in America have been saying for decades, and I use this phrase a lot on the show, and it has place here in what you just said. There are Black Americans who've been saying for the longest time that our justice system and many of our systems are not necessarily the most efficient and fair, and they need revamping and a lot of different words to describe what should be part of the change. But one of the things that I've been saying for the longest time, and one of my cohorts here on the station, is that there's monsters in the closet. Mm-hmm. And people will, well, no, Richard, there's not monsters in the closet. And we've been sounding the alarm. And I'm not just saying that Black folks are the only folks who've been sounding the alarm, but because I'm not saying that. You've been sounding the alarm for a long time, and you're not Black. But the point is, you're a woman that's paid attention to now that the monsters now are under the bed and in the sheets with us, and they did it slowly because people didn't. My whole point of all this stream is people sometimes, many times, lots of times in America don't pay attention to what's happening when people have been sounding the alarm. So there have been Black folks, white folks, Hispanic folks, Jewish folks, Latinos, Muslims that have been sounding the alarm.
Yeah.
But then we have an election where 75 million people, this is why I asked the question about people, do they want to be run by a dictator? 75 million people said, I'm going to vote for this versus that, Kim. And how did we get to that?
Yeah, well, look, this is, again, the American experience is, echoed in other parts of the world. And basically what happens is that you get mainstream parties that don't differ much from each other. They alternate. Voters vote first for one, then the other, looking for change. And they don't get change. And this happens over a long period of time. My husband is just a relatively newly naturalized U.S. citizen. When he came to this country, he said, do you have anybody other than Bushes or Clintons who were running for high office? Right? I mean, it looked like a clan system to him when he showed up, right? So basically there's been a lot of time in which the mainstream parties here and the mainstream parties in many other countries have promised moderate change. They get elected. They don't produce any change at all. And so finally voters get really fed up and they vote for somebody who's going to smash the system, somebody who looks unusual, somebody who's out of the norm, somebody who isn't held in place by all of the, strings of association and commitment that mainstream parties tend to have with each other. And it's exactly that drive for change that motivates people to vote for whoever the major change agent looks like. And, it's a cry from voters saying politics as usual is not good enough. And you can understand that because, of course, in the U.S., we've had, the arc of justice, I'm trying to find the
arc of
book, sort of arc
justice
of justice
is long, but the arc of Yeah, it bends toward justice.
Whatever, moves toward justice. Goodness, my early morning can't come up with a quote. But,
Me too.
But that has not been true for a long time, and so you understand why frustrated people will vote for a candidate for change. Just to put, again, the U.S. in perspective, the two mainstream parties in almost every democracy in the world have lost massive amounts of support over the last 20 to 30 years. So it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon in which mainstream parties are not up to the modern challenges. And just in the last couple of weeks, you've seen, first the government of Germany fell. Yesterday, the government of France fell. And a lot of this is because they've got these fractured political systems in which there's no one party that gets enough votes to create a stable government. So they have these unstable coalitions that limp along until there's some issue that breaks up the coalition. And then the government falls and you get early elections. And, so this is kind of the cycle you're seeing in other countries. Here we don't have the possibility of having, a government fall and snap elections. We just muddle on with gridlock, until the next regularly scheduled election. But we have exactly the same problem. So it's not just unique to the United States. It's that governments don't have the operating room to bring serious change. And since this is a progressive station, let me lean into why I think that's true. And that's that we have this immensely globalized economy. Mm-hmm. In an immensely globalized economy, national leaders don't have a lot of room to develop purely national economic policies, because the globalized economy keeps pulling you back to, lots of trade, jobs moving to where workers are paid the least, and so on. It makes it very hard to set up, welfare states inside democratic governments anymore. Welfare states are being cut back everywhere. Makes it extremely hard to promise more jobs or more prosperity when it's actually a global economy you're talking about and not a national one. So what you're seeing is that candidates are moving away from the old-fashioned politics of, whether it's deregulation or social state, those left-right alternatives. And they're moving toward more identity questions, things like abortion, things like affirmative action, things like yesterday's Supreme Court decision on gender-affirming care for minors,
Right.
So those issues are kind of all or nothing and national. Those are things leaders can do something about. And so you wind up with a world of culture wars in which those national divisive issues become the only ground on which politicians can play, And in that kind of world, people retreat to their corners, and you wind up getting much more polarization on issues like that because they're all or nothing. You can't say, well, we'll have 20% of the abortions we had last year. Like, that's just not a policy, right?
Right.
So, but you can have 20% of the economic redistribution that you had last year or something like that. Economic issues tend to be more or less, they tend to be capable of compromise. And those are not the issues on which politicians run, So anyway, in this world of polarization, it's just a fertile field for, aspirational autocrats to come in, take advantage of that polarization, promise radical change, especially on things that actually they won't be able to do anything about. And then once in office, they start to play with the infrastructure of government, packing the courts with judges, putting their own people in charge of various institutions, breaking down the norms so that they're no longer norms that bind the government. And in many ways, just preparing the ground for the autocrat and their allies to stay in power forever. So all that's happening kind of under the surface while you have the culture wars raging as the issues that voters are being asked to vote on.
Will the states have the power to push back? I mean, I just talked about what California is doing, what here in Illinois, Governor Pritzker is doing. Do you think the states, if they decide to stop fighting over crumbs and pull together as, Democratic governors, for example?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, this is the main promise that we've got for maintaining Democratic government through the next Trump term. The thing is that Pritzker and Newsom so far have not been joined by a lot of other governors. I'm here in New Jersey, which used to be a reliably blue state. Excuse me. Biden won the state by 18 points. Harris won it by 5. So New Jersey now has become not a 50-50 state, but a state in which Trump supporters are a big group that our current governor cannot ignore. Mm-hmm. So our governor in this traditionally blue state is saying, well, let's take it issue by issue. Sometimes we can cooperate, and sometimes, we won't be able to. So if you have a lot of governors around the country, more like our New Jersey governor than like your Illinois governor, you won't have the critical mass of states to push back, So I think it's going to take a while before we see how radical the Trump people are going to be. It could be that the Trump folks are going to lean into, as you see with the cabinet picks being rolled out, they might lean into blitz autocracy, which is one of these things that, say, Viktor Orbán did, where literally within 3 years he had captured everything about the Hungarian government, and it looks a little bit like the Trump people are going to follow the Orbán playbook. Very different when you have a Russia scenario where, Putin consolidated his control over institutions over a decade. It was much slower and much harder to discern while it was going on. But I think Trump, having lost office once, realizes he's got to do it all in this term, or else he'll get thrown out in 2024.
And won't that come? Kim? Will that in part come from 2028? Since the quote unquote, we'd like to say the sensible Republicans, seeing that this is going to impact their livelihood and their sustainability, or where will it come? I mean, that's the question I think everybody's asking. Where will the line be drawn? Where will it come from as we wrap up? And we're going to have you back, because I'm sitting here going, stop taking notes and listen. Stop taking notes and listen. So, but to take a minute or so just to say where you think it will come from. And we're going to schedule to have you back on the show again, because your message is far too important.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, I hate to say that we're in for a wild ride, but so where's the pushback? So I do think states are going to make a difference. I think the blue states' attorneys general, who are going to be bringing lawsuits against a lot of what Trump is doing, will make a difference. What we've seen, however, almost everywhere, is that it's also people going to the streets. In all the places where autocracy has really been pushed back, once it gets a start, it's that you really have a mass public reaction that the politicians can't ignore. And we had a little bit of that at the beginning of Trump 1, but now I'm seeing free and fair election, peaceful transfer of power. In some sense, the Democrats have backed themselves into thinking that opposition is somehow, doing ourselves what we criticized them for doing last time. But there's a difference between trying to overthrow an incoming government and protesting what it's going to do. So
right.
I think it's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of mobilization to make clear that we can't lose our government this time.
Yeah, good point. Wow. I broke my
Sorry
own.
for the bad news.
No, listen. I know I prepared myself for your interview because I read your piece and I was like, okay, I need to prepare the listeners for what Kim's going to bring, because she's going to bring the heat in getting people's attention. I think that's a big part of this is now folks have got to wake the hell up and stop leaning into their privilege and their purview and their comfort and not be comfortable, because we can't afford to be. Yeah. And so I appreciate your very, sobering words, because sometimes sobering words are needed to get people's attention. And Kim, it would be an honor to have you back. I want to have you talk about this, because I think a lot of people need to hear it in an unfiltered way in which you just delivered it. So hopefully we can have you back.
Great. Thanks much. And so glad that you've got progressive radio in Chicago, which was not there when I was living there, but, Chicago is a blue city in a blue state, and that's, you got at least a bunch of people around who can give you some comfort.
And we know how to fight, so.
That's good.
All right, Kim.
When we fight, we win,
When we fight, we win. Guys, It's been great having Kim with us this morning. We will have you back. Thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and experiences with us, and we appreciate you being with us, Kim.
Great. Lovely to talk to you this morning.
All right, we'll talk with you soon.